Good evening, everyone. Over the last 3 days, I've had, amongst many things, 3 very specific things to do. I had to convince a new PhD student in history to work on the topic of runaway slaves, slaves at the Cape. I had to meet with a potential funder in Cape Town to support a project about democratic capital. And I had to write a Finwe column about Bill Easterly's latest NBR working paper, in which he builds a case that Africa's structural adjustment programs was not as bad as they seemed. Now, these 3 activities may seem to have nothing in common, but that would be wrong. Dear friends, members of the Rectorate, Vice Rector for Social Impact, Transformation and Personnel, and the Chief Operating Officer, our Vice Dean, colleagues, students, friends. The person that ties all of these disparate things together is Suresh Naidu. Suresh Naidu is Professor of Economics and International and Public Affairs at Columbia University School for International and Public Affairs. Naidu previously served as Harvard Academy Junior Scholar at Harvard University and as an instructor in economics and political economy at the University of California, Berkeley. He holds a B. Math from the University of Waterloo, an MA in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Naidu's research interests are diverse. He has written on labor market institutions in American history, on slavery, slave collateral, and runaway slaves in the US South, so you could see the first link there to the 3 things I've mentioned. He has written with Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson on the relationship between democracy and growth, a seminal paper that we cite in our application to the funder. And he has most recently, with Gabriel Zachman and Danny Roderick, who now sits on Cyril Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council, organized a network of economists under the banner Economists for Inclusive Prosperity. In their piece in the Boston Review earlier this year, the 3 caution against economists' over-reliance on markets. It is in this paper that Bill Easterly cites, or it's this paper that Bill Easterly cites in his most recent NBR working paper, which is of course the 3rd link that I've mentioned. I want to thank Suresh for joining us in Stellenbosch this week to present the 4th LEAP lecture. It's a far flight from the US, we know, for only 3 or 4 days in South Africa. The Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past is a research group within economics department and history department that aims to nurture and promote the study of economic history, broadly defined, at Stellenbosch University. With the support of internal and external funding, we are able to recruit and support students and undertake the expensive task of transcribing historical sources for those students and for the faculty to work with. I'm happy to report that LEAP continues to grow. This year we have 6 postdoc students, for example, that are pursuing what I think are very innovative, groundbreaking projects. Many of those who ensure that we have the financial means to do this are in the audience tonight, and I want to thank you for your generous support. One of the things that this funding allows us to do is to host the LEAP lecture. Links to the first 3 lectures by Marianne Wanamaker, Emmanuel Champong, and Anthony Hopkins is available on our website. Tonight we have Suresh Naidu to talk to us about the terms of service, monopsony from American slavery to Amazon mechanical Turk. Suresh, thank you very much for flying halfway around the world. We look forward to listening to you.
Okay, thank you so much for hosting me. This is in fact my 2nd time in Stellenbosch, and it's lovely. And this has to rank as possibly my favorite country in the world to visit is South Africa. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is labor market monopsony, and I feel like it's very interesting to talk about it to a South African audience, where in some ways this is the place you kind of need to convince least about this, both given the history and given, if there was one place you had to make the case that there was never really ever anything that looked like the laissez-faire or Econ 101 labor market, you would think it might be South Africa. And so I'm looking forward to some questions afterwards, just to think about how or even whether this is relevant. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to explain what monopsony is in kind of everyday terms, and just kind of how we think about it in contemporary labor economics. And then I'm going to kind of march through a bunch of American economic history with this like lens of monopsony in mind. So I think it's going to, we're going to talk about slavery and how slavery is actually a labor market without any monopsony. And then we're going to talk about monopsony by legal artifice, and this is master and servant law, and its use not only in the UK, but its kind of genealogy throughout the empire, and that master and servant law sort of keeps coming back it's kind of embedded in the common law. And then talk about another version of labor markets without monopsony, and that's American unions in the 20th century. And this is a very American-specific historical context, so we should think about how it relates to say, collective bargaining in, for example, in South Africa, which is very interesting to me. And if I get to it, I kind of want to talk about something that's like the future of work, which is a constant theme in the U.S. And one is this idea that there's constantly this talk about robots crowding out employment and excess automation, and I think none of that's going to happen. What we're instead going to have is sort of what I'm going to call like a full employment dystopia, where we're going to have lots and lots of jobs, but everyone's just going to be indifferent between working and quitting. Okay. So the monopsony thought experiment is, I think when you put it this way, it helps a lot. Just think of the thought experiment of an employer that cuts their wages by, let's say, 10%. And what percent of workers do you think leave? Leave over 1 year, leave over 5 years? What traditional economics says is that basically everyone leaves, and they do so very quickly. And that's basically the assumption that perfect competition imposes, is that any firm that dares to cut its wages will instantly lose all of its workers to its competitors. And so once you have that view, then that means the only thing that can enter something as a force that determines an individual's wages is basically their own skills, which are going to be determine their value at all possible firms, as well as any particular taste they might have for amenities in working in one place versus another. But one thing that recent research has shown, and I think the availability of matched worker firm data really has made this clear, is that you can kind of see the exact same worker getting paid different wages at different firms. And so that's basically that the law of one price doesn't hold in the labor market. And once you sort of like can see that, then that really does suggest that there are really kind of important frictions in the labor market. And so one way to quantify how big those frictions are is to think about this number, which is the labor supply elasticity facing the firm. So that's the answer to that question of suppose you lower hourly wages at your company by 10%, what percentage of workers leave? That's going to be given by this elasticity. And basically in the US, we're seeing the evidence is sort of based on this is growing, and we're seeing that this number is between 2 to 5, which implies between 20 and 50% of workers leave. And we can sort of estimate this number in a variety of empirical contexts. So in other work that I'm not going to talk about here, I've estimated it for migrant workers in the UAE, and find that they have a remarkably low labor supply elasticity of 1 when their contracts expire. But if I get to it today, we'll also show you that it's also incredibly low in even online labor markets, where there's no search frictions, where there's thousands of employers and thousands of workers. And even in that sort of putatively incredibly competitive environment, you still see that there's a considerable amount of friction, in the sense of when you randomize wages for the exact same job, you don't see take-up of that job change very much. And so that suggests that employers have considerable scope to affect wages. So that's kind of the kind of background theory of what I'm kind of interested in. And so this is just the kind of graph that has been made in the literature. This is made from Oregon data, and it's just kind of showing that when you look at a worker when they switch a firm, you see their wages change, and it changes both up when you get a better job, but it also changes down by about the same amount when you get a worse job. So it really does, like, about your firm, which firm you are at, really does affect the wage that you're the wage that you're paid. There's also some recent, very clever, I think, experimental evidence from Uber. So these folks, Caldwell and Olson, worked with Uber to like randomize wages for Uber drivers. And then they could look at workers that had both like another platform, Lyft, on their platform, and could see how much people switch between Lyft and Uber in response to an earnings increase in Uber. And they get that it's a remarkably small fraction, given that all you have to do is switch apps. And it's only about, like, it's between a 20 to 40% chance of switching platforms. So even in like a place where switching costs are very low, you sort of still see this, pretty inelastic switching response or supply elasticity. So I don't want to talk about it all here, but there's a smorgasbord of evidence on monopsony, just coming from all these different angles, from rent sharing to the effects of concentration on wages, to looking at what happens when like a worker suddenly dies at a firm, what happens to the payroll relative to sales. And you can sort of see that payroll falls a lot less than sales fall, so that implies that the worker is getting paid less than their marginal product. And so there's a variety of evidence out there, and so I'm not going to talk about a lot of it contemporary, and I really want to focus on the historical stuff today. And part of that historical thing is also, I didn't make this up. I mean, it was actually a canon of institutionalist labor economics in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. And so the term is coined by Joan Robinson, who, you know, if you ask me, is like the greatest economist of the 20th century, and I won't argue about it. But the ideas that immediately made their way into American labor economics, and were just sort of thought of as a very natural way to model what a laissez-faire labor market looked like, was this idea that, you know, firms don't necessarily face a perfectly elastic supply of labor. And so there's a bunch of quotes there, but at the bottom is my favorite, which is from a very famous US labor economist. He's like, yeah, monopsony is probably true, but it's irrelevant because the future of labor markets is unions. And so he's writing in 1950. So he just got that completely wrong on the, but it had the idea that if the labor market was laissez-faire, it would look like monopsonistic competition. And so why is there this market power? Why doesn't it look like the textbook labor market? And so the way to think about it is this trade-off that firms are facing between wages and turnover. And so it's like you can either pick, you know, if you pay a really high wage and you keep lots of your workers, that's, you know, not as profitable as potentially lowering the wage, absorbing the additional turnover, and making profits off the ones that stay. And so why does anyone stay? Well, one of the reasons is that there are search costs, it's hard to find another job. Sometimes there's often there's very few employers, so the labor market's concentrated. Often, surprisingly often, it's just collusion. Like there's lots of informal norms among employers that kind of agree not to raise wages and not to poach each other's workers. But I think the most interesting is just this idea that labor is not like your usual commodity. It's a high-dimensional object where you really care about your relationships with your coworkers, with your boss, your commute time, how it works with your daycare. All of these things kind of enter into your evaluation of the job, and so that the wage is actually only about 50 to 75% of the value of the job. And you're not a very experienced job shopper. Most people don't shop for many jobs in their life, particularly relative to how much firms shop for workers. And so that just makes you a little bit less responsive to changes in wages than otherwise. And then employers know that, so that they know that we don't have to pay everyone exactly their productivity, because while we might lose some people, we'll make enough profits off those that stay that it's worth it to us. So it's worth that kind of additional turnover. And so I'll come back to this. This is on that's the evidence from Mechanical Turk about when you run these experiments about randomizing wages on the thick online labor market. You see that this elasticity of labor supply facing a requester is very small. It's a 0.14. So that implies, that a 10% cut in wages reduces the take-up rate by 1.4%. It's really tiny. Okay, and so one of the reasons monopsony I think is interesting from like a normative or philosophical perspective is that it gives even mainstream neoclassical economists like a language to think about the word exploitation, and in a way that it's kind of, you don't have to inhale the labor theory of value in order to like have the idea of exploitation. And it's the idea is that there's some transactions that you think might be normatively unfair, but they're still strictly voluntary. in a laissez-faire labor market. So there's no coercion, it's mutually beneficial, and it depends on you thinking that somehow the competitive outcome is the fair transaction. And so much has been made about monopsony implies that there's like kind of what gets called neoclassical exploitation, where wages are below the marginal product of labor. And it's strictly stronger in the sense that it implies sort of what would be traditionally called Marxist exploitation, which you can think of as wages are below average product. But you still kind of get this result that employers are exploiting workers, not as a sort of as some normative thing, but as it's kind of a description of the world. And it's important not to think that because it exists, it has to be gotten rid of. Remember, it might be that you need those monopsonistic profits in order to cover some other fixed cost of starting up, in order to cover something else about the business, in which case eliminating it is not feasible, and in which case it would be difficult to think about its injustice. And in particular, I think it's going to be interesting when we talk about inequality in the parts about unions, is that there's not necessarily a connection between how much you're paid and how much you're exploited. And sometimes some of the things that we're going to see is sometimes the highest skilled, highest paid workers are can be among the most exploited in the sense of having the largest gap between wages and marginal product. I'll skip this. Okay, let's jump onto the economic history part of this. So if you have this basic view that laissez-faire free labor markets have a degree of monopsony power in them, and so what you can think about is the variety of labor market institutions that have existed in the past, that exist sort of across countries, about how they kind of manage that or how they either enhance it or mitigate it using a variety of institutional constructs or policies. And so the very extreme case, you can think of slavery, American slavery. And American slavery is, I think, somewhat distinct in this in that it's the most commercialized, most market-friendly variant of slavery that you have in the world. This is a place where it's sophisticated. There's auctions everywhere. It's a very commercial variant of slavery, and so it looks like a market in a real way. And but that's going to look like a labor market where there isn't actually a monopsony, because you don't have to distort the price in any sense to like exploit labor. You can just do it with violence and coercion. You don't have to distort the market price in any way. And then we're going to move to the post-slavery period and talk about the Jim Crow in the United States South, where there's a variety of legal constrictions coming back from, some of them coming back from a revitalization of master and servant law after the emancipation of slaves in the U.S., and that sort of British master and servant law gets kind of repurposed in the U.S. South as a tool to control labor after emancipation. And then the last historical institution is kind of another way of getting rid of monopsony in some ways, is to take the wage setting power out of the control of employers and hand it either over to unions or the government. And what I'm going to talk about is unions, if I get there, and sort of talk about the historical trajectory of union increase and decrease in the United States. Okay. So just to make this point again, the price of enslaved workers has nothing to do with the worker quitting, working hard, or it's purely a device for allocating, because you're using all of this violence and state power to solve these other problems that an employer faces of retention and incentives. And you can also ignore workers' tastes completely. And so the price is kind of free to allocate supply and demand. And so that makes the slavery in the U.S. look closer to a commodity market than a labor market, in the sense that you kind of have this standardized contracts on people being trafficked all over the U.S. And so that's part of what slavery gives the U.S. South in the form of like a productivity in agriculture, is that you don't, in order to populate these lands on the frontier, you can kind of just move your workforce with you. And you go to New Orleans, you take out a giant loan, you buy 50 slaves, and then you go out to the frontier outside of Arkansas and you set up a plantation and you don't have to worry about finding local labor. While in the US North, where you don't have access to slavery, you have to bring your family, you have to find some sort of free laborers that are willing to work, and that just makes it harder to kind of take advantage of the new lands that are opening up on the frontier. And so if you wanted to think about what the antebellum US slavery analog of quits is, it's fugitive slaves. And I just wanted to talk about this paper a bit, which is that the census in 1850 and 1860 asks questions about fugitive slaves in the past year, and so the counts are incredibly low. It's like about 1,000 out of a population of 3 million. Enslaved people. And so you look at these numbers and you sort of see all this documentary evidence in the historical record of people constantly being worried about their slaves. And so how to sort of reconcile this sentiment that you encounter in the documents with the just low counts. So one of the things that we did, sorry, the title is wrong, is that we pulled kind of from all of these newspapers, we pulled the universe of these runaway slave ads, which gave you the name, gave you the owner, gave you a variety of characteristics. And so that's what those ads look like, or that little woodcut in the bottom left-hand corner. And this is evidence from, and one of the things you can see, because you pull every ad, you can see the duration of a runaway spell. And they're short. It's like 6 weeks. And that's sort of confirmed by by that graph. That's from cotton picking books. So on the cotton picking books during the harvest, they would write in when someone was running away. And so you can see in the picking books this kind of disappearance of people during the harvest, but note that it comes right back down. So about 15% of workers are missing at the peak of, during the harvest, and then it comes right back down, consistent with the fact that they're either coming back or getting caught. And so you should think of like the spell of a fugitive as very short, and no one makes it out. Like the actual escape rate is incredibly tiny. And so, when you can use these ads together with the census to like benchmark the true runaway population by looking at the intersection of these two populations. So if you look at just the ads that are posted around when the census is taken, you can then sort of count and say, oh, that person is reporting a runaway in the census, but are they actually advertising for it? And so if you sort of find that there's a very low overlap in that, it suggests that there's a much larger population of runaway slaves that are sort of either not reported in the census or not advertised. And so no matter what you do with that number, yes, there's more, but you can't blow it up by more than a factor of like 10. And so no matter how you cut it, there's just not that many runaways in the South. So the system really worked to like keep keep the kind of fugitive rate low. But then also when you have this take that the problem that slavery is solving is the problem of turnover and the problems that free labor has to use the wage to solve. You get kind of an economic theory of slavery that's sort of very different from the Fogel and Engerman sort of theory of slavery. So what the comparative advantage of slave agriculture looks like is its flexibility, its ability to move labor all over the place. So when you look at the plantations in the U.S. South, this is like coefficients of sort of estimates of the marginal product of labor for farms without slaves and farms with slaves, and what you see is that the distribution is much narrower for enslaved farms and higher. So that's like the idea is that the market, in the sense of like setting the marginal product of labor, equating it across farms, is working much better for the slave plantations than it is working for free workers. And so that's part of the kind of allocative, in the sense of productivity, it's the allocative advantage of slavery. And you can also use this to then build some sort of other ideas about what explains the differences between slave and free agriculture. So Flesig in 1976 kind of made this argument, which is that when you have the idea that slavery is an elastic supply of labor facing the farm, what that means is that the best entrepreneurs, the ones that can operate the largest establishments select into the slave agriculture sector in the South, and they run these giant plantations. While in the North, they kind of enter manufacturing or are sort of constrained by the amount of labor that they can get access to. And so then you get these plantations are much bigger than any free farm can get because they're not subject to the labor constraint that free farms are. You also get that there's less mechanization, that there's lower capital labor ratios in slave versus free agriculture, again, because you don't have this labor constraint. Also, on the very micro level, you also then sort of see that one of the things you can do with cotton, for example, is that you can leave it in the field longer, because you don't have to worry about when harvest labor getting bid away by the competition during the harvest period. So because you're not facing any labor market competition in the harvest, you can kind of let crops sort of stay in the ground a little bit longer. You also get that the patterns of technological change in the US South and North are very different. So there's an innovation in the South called the slave shovel, which basically consists of taking a shovel and putting a steel rod down the back of it, because enslaved people would just break shovels deliberately all the time, which makes a lot of sense. And so the innovation there is like putting a steel rod in the back so that people don't break those shovels. And so that's a very labor augmenting form of technological innovation. In contrast that with what's happening at the same time in the US North is they're inventing the Mccormick Grouper, which is like a way of sort of automating the harvest using horses. And so you kind of get that because the labor constraint is binding in the North and not in the South, you sort of get this labor-saving technological change in northern agriculture versus labor augmenting in the South. You also get that one of the things that this is telling you is that the advantage of slavery is not just in its productivity, but also its ability to just ignore workers' particular tastes for working for in a particular task or a particular place. And so what you see is that even after you condition on agricultural productivity and cotton productivity, you still get that a big predictor of the fraction slave in a county is the malarial incidence. Because one of the things you're doing is you're putting enslaved people where no free workers want to work, because they're malarial. And similarly, actually, you can do this within army forts where they have both slave and free workers working in the same army forts. And you see that even within those forts, slaves are allocated to kind of jobs that have higher morbidity rates, for example. So it's like you're able to ignore workers' tastes, which is kind of the thing that often generates monopsony in the free labor market, that this is not present there. And then finally, I think the idea that slavery was this very thick and liquid market for property rights in people. It also meant that it was like kind of the best form of collateral that you could have in the U.S. South. If you compare it to the other thing of land, land is not terribly mobile. It's not terribly pledgeable. So you can imagine that creditors would be much more willing to take a fairly liquid and tradable asset like slaves as collateral relative to land. So the paper I have on this is, so Maryland is one of the states in the US that was a slave state that did not fight in the Civil War. So it actually had to have a vote about whether or not to abolish slavery. And the vote was shockingly close. But it passed. And then what you see is that what this graph shows is that before the abolition of slavery in Maryland, so we linked it to credit market reports for business that measure business startup rates, is that you then see that before the abolition of slavery, slave owners are starting businesses at a much higher rate than non-slave owners. And then after the abolition of slavery, that advantage that slave owners had just goes away, and so they're starting businesses at the same rate as non-slave owners. And we argue in the paper that it's collateral, but partly because you can kind of see it. Partly because in Maryland there's actually a very active rental market in slaves, so the production advantages are available to non-owners. It's just the collateral value that's available to owners. And you see large effects even in the sectors that don't use slaves in production. So think retail. So retail trade, you need collateral for inventory and trade credit, but you don't need to use slaves in production. And you still see like equally large effects in that sector. Okay, and so that's the end of slavery with emancipation. So just to remind you that not that you would necessarily be so up on US history. So when slavery is ended in the United States in 1863 with the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment is very interesting legally because it's the one part of the US Constitution that is a restriction on what private actors can do with each other. Everything else in the US Constitution is kind of a restriction on what the state's relationship to its citizens. But what the 13th Amendment does is it says you cannot privately contract yourself into servitude. And it's interesting that they use both slavery and servitude because they have ideas about forms of bonded labor that are not just chattel slavery. They are, in fact, include like the Mexican peonage system that's just coming online and that has just come under U.S. control in New Mexico. And they have in mind, they understand that there's these other forms of forced labor, and they don't want those coming back either. And then this period of Reconstruction between when the South is defeated in the Civil War versus when all the Northern troops leave is kind of a period where you actually did see something very much like labor market competition. And one of the interesting things is like how the Northern armies like looked like an antitrust authority in the sense that they deliberately went in and broke up cartels, attempts by planters to form cartels of labor markets. And so that's the quote there. He's like, has prohibited meetings of planters and other combinations to regulate the wages of the freedmen. And then what you sort of saw is that these planters have to figure out how to like handle the fact that labor is leaving and there's lots of turnover, and they kind of complain about it all the time. They're like, "What? Our workers are leaving." And so once the North withdraws the armies, then you start seeing all these political things come back that are sort of designed to kind of reimpose the control of black labor. And so this was noted by, say, Du Bois, that the ignorance of the labor market outside his own vicinity is increased rather than diminished by the laws of nearly every southern state. But the issue is that there's so many laws, and because of the sort of very informal way in which the legal system in the US South worked, they're much more selectively enforced. So any law that was binding, that could be enforced against black Americans in the South was likely very selectively enforced. So you can't really use what's passed in the letter of the law as necessarily what was happening on the ground. But there's one category of law that's called anti-enticement, which is fines that planters levied on each other for trying to poach each other's workers. And so because that was falling on whites, it is actually likely to follow the letter of the law in a way that laws that were binding on blacks didn't. And so you can use the variation in the fines that were being charged for trying to poach each other's workers. And so I did this in an earlier paper of mine. And basically you get that like when you double this enticement fine, so it's like the fine that you pay for poaching another planter's labor, it basically looks like it reduces agricultural wages by between 1% and 2%. And so this is, if you want to think about it, this is all coming from additional monopsony power. It basically looks like you're increasing the labor supply elasticity by about 0.5. And so how could you estimate kind of how much this system benefited white planters? One of the things that was one of the informal dimensions of this is how much planters basically would offer a variety of non-wage benefits to black workers in order to, because they're making so much profit off of each worker because of these monopsony rents, you're then quite willing to offer workers things like health insurance, but in particular protection from violence from other whites as like a device. So that, oh, you work for me, I'll protect you and give you a pension, but certainly protect you from violence. And that's worth it to these planters because they're making so much money off of the profits for each worker, and so that's one explanation for, by the way, that's convincing, I think, about why the U.S. South is so hostile to the expansion of the welfare state in the New Deal, is that the planters are really benefiting from this informal insurance that they're providing, and extending the welfare system into that would have crowded out the gains they got from that. And so how much was this sort of black monopsony worth to white landowners? And so I have a paper with Rick Hornbeck that kind of looks at the 1927 Mississippi flood, and we can use the estimates from that paper to get a sense of how much the value of even post-slavery exploitation to white landowners. So what happens? You have this flood. It's a flood. It's like Right before this flood, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said, "We don't have to worry about floods again." And so, famous last words. And so there's this flood, and these are the flooded counties in the Mississippi Delta. And one of the interesting things that the levees kind of selectively broke, so some places got flooded, some places didn't. And the flood results in this big change in fraction black. And so basically, this is one of the big push factors that kind of drives a whole exodus of black labor outside of the U.S. South. So they go to Chicago, they go to St. Louis, they go all over, and you see that persists. So it's like this is that's the 1920, 1930 it falls, and then it just stays low. And actually, interesting, total population doesn't change. It's just the racial composition changes. And then what you see is that these planters in these flooded counties respond by mechanizing earlier. So they like adopt tractors and automate much earlier. And output per acre increases a lot in these flooded, in these places. But interestingly, per acre land values fall. So all this black labor is pushed out, but yet the per acre land value falls. Some of that is bringing in worse quality land, but some of it is because the actual previous system was incredibly profitable. And so you can use that sort of change in land value with respect to like the change in fraction black as an estimate of like, here's how much the additional profits you're making off of black labor, you're sort of capitalized into the land value. And so that sort of, you can use that to do a calculation of like, you know, if the total agricultural population is 50% black and there's about $1.5 billion in southern farm values, it implies something like $250 billion today. And just because there's like this kind of ongoing reparations conversation in the U.S., a lot of people end it with slavery, and it's just like, well, if you really wanted to run it forward, there's plenty of exploitation that happens afterwards, and we can try to calculate those numbers also. Okay, and so what anti-enticement law is, it's actually a vestige of, and you guys all know this in South Africa, it's a vestige of this English master and servant law. And master and servant law is itself like a vestige from this statute of laborers, which is passed in 1351 in response to the Black Death. And it has various provisions in it, like breaching a contract is a criminal offense. And things like that, and it sort of diffuses around the British Empire, and it's used in tea plantations in Assam, it's used in Kenya, it's used in South Africa, and it's used until as late as 1977 in South Africa. I think it's the latest use of the criminalization of contract breach. And so I have in some other work I've looked at master and servant law in England and looked at how like the use of master and servant law responded to labor market tightness. So when the labor market's really tight, you like use prosecutions a lot more because you didn't have to respond with wages. And then when it's repealed, then you start seeing wages grow in the places that had used it more. And then one of the interesting things, and maybe where I'll sort of start to wind up, is so master and servant law, you actually could contract around it. You didn't have to sign a master and a servant contract. You could say I wanted a spot contract, and so that it wouldn't be criminal for me to leave. So why did you need to legally repeal it as opposed to just let the market kind of privately contract around it? And the interesting thing is that it's because employers couldn't commit not to use it. So if you had it on the books, and particularly they couldn't commit to not use it against strikes. So even though if you might not go after an individual worker, when all of your workers sort of collectively did not show up for work, you had this tool of master and servant law that you could use to like criminalize the strike. And so with the so that what's made the biggest opposition to master and servant law was unions. And so in England, the labor movement's a key legislative opponent of master and servant law, and as soon as the trade union movement's legalized, one of its first demands is to get repeal of master and servant law. And it also turns out that master and servant law kind of infects a lot of the judiciary in the US. So the judiciary in the US has a lot more power than in most other countries, and because master and servant law was sitting there in the common law, the judges were had this like very anti-labor sentiment all throughout the 19th and early 20th century. So they're striking down statutes that are trying to protect labor in all kinds of ways. And so And so, in fact, like unions in the U.S. and Kansas in the 1920s strike the courts because the courts are kind of ruling against them. So the unions also in the U.S. were like a big opponent of judicial discretion over labor law prior to the New Deal. And that sort of makes sense in terms of this political need to sort of keep strikes as a credible threat. And so, actually, maybe I'll just talk about this very quickly, and then I'll actually open it up to questions. So, when you also think about what monopsony does, if you imagine that the laissez-faire labor market is monopsonistic, then that means that there's room for all kinds of institutions to raise wages without costing employment. Because you're not on the labor demand curve, you're on the labor supply curve, and so when you push up wages, there's some room over which you can like raise wages, and you don't have to worry about necessarily killing employment. Now, there's a little bit of a sophistication to that. It's that what happens is that when you raise wages, either by unions or minimum wages, is you increase the average cost of labor, but you decrease the marginal cost of labor. So if you have a whole bunch of like really marginal firms that are just hanging around at the bottom there, you're going to drive those guys out of business, but you might expand the high productivity guys. So the net effects on employment are going to be ambiguous from this. But the broad point is that there's some wiggle room that you can take advantage of. And what's interesting is that when you look at what unions do, and I think this is remarkably constant around the world, is that the union premium is basically between 10 to 20%. And that's a remarkably stable number. It's remarkably stable in the US. It goes pretty much, when you go all the way back to 1936, you kind of get a union premium of something like between 10 and 20%. And despite the fact that unions like started low, got really high, and then fell again, you kind of still, that number is reasonably constant. And that's despite the fact that like who's in unions changes a lot. So in the mid-century US, the average union member was much less educated than the average non-union member. But if you look at that today, the average union member is about the same education as a non-union member. And what labor economists have sort of traditionally focused on is that unions, the effect that unions have on inequality is limited to the effects on skilled versus unskilled. So it's really, the traditional labor economics literature is sort of worried about its effects on wage compression. But one of the things that we did in this paper with Hank Farber and Eliana Kuzemko and Dan Herbst is that we found, the backstory. Nobody in the US, the government surveys only started asking about union status in 1973. So this whole history of unions in the 20th century, there was just no microdata. So people were just looking at aggregate counts of union members that were given by the unions themselves, and the unions were just lying all the time. But it turns out one group did ask about unions all the time, and that's political pollsters. So political pollsters asked about households whether or not they were in unions, and that starts in 1936. So we kind of harmonized, probably 1 million of these observations from political polls and used that as a source to measure who was in unions, what were they making, kind of going all the way back to the 20th century. And so traditionally people have looked at just the effect on skilled versus unskilled wages, but what we could do with this data is construct like union density at the level of the state going back all the way to 1937. And so what that means is that you could look at like spillovers. So it might be that unions don't just affect union members, but they also affect wages in non-union sectors. This is not a mystery in most countries that have these kinds, like in South Africa where you have sectoral bargaining. That's par for the course. But in the US, there is no sectoral bargaining. You're just covered at firm level contracts. And so it's a puzzle that unions have these spillover effects in the US. But you can kind of make sense of that with monopsony, right? Because if you have this labor market with imperfect competition and you drive up wages in one part of the market, that's going to force other companies to raise their wages also, just from like imperfect labor market competition. And then you're also going to get that unions are going to have effects on inequality that are not just limited to like between worker inequality. It's also going to be, they're also going to potentially affect the capital labor split of income, because a component of the capital share under monopsony is this pure profits being made off of these inframarginal workers, that you're sort of getting this gap between marginal product and wage. And so a component of the capital share of income is in fact profits. And so, one of the things unions can do is then cut into this capital labor share. This is what this graph kind of looks similar to this like all over the OECD. So like this U shape in union density and the inverse U in inequality. Certainly all the Anglo OECD countries kind of have something that looks like this happening. But what we did with our data was look at the state year panel, sort of going back actually let's go back to 1937. And when you can take out state and year fixed effects and lots of other controls, and what you see is, so that's the Gini coefficient, that's top 10% share, and that's the labor share of income. And you see that unions kind of, even after all of these controls, have this pretty tight negative effect on inequality, and not just like kind of the usual measure of the Gini coefficient. They're actually, unions are affecting parts of the income distribution where you don't think there's any union members necessarily. So they're affecting like the top 10% share, they're affecting the capital labor split, and so that's kind of something you get when you realize one of the things about monopsony is that the part of the return to capital is these monopsony rents. Okay, so I'll just wrap up with this. So I didn't talk today about what I think is really interesting, which is the interaction between monopsony and sort of what are called efficiency wage or labor discipline models, where what you need to do is you need to give workers like a high wage just so that they get them to work. And so, because you want them to be worried about getting fired. And you want that because you want a model where kind of both workers are afraid of getting fired, but employers are also afraid of losing profits from this monopsony power. And so you need a model with both kind of monopsony power and these efficiency wages. And what that's really interesting is it tells you that employers might have a lot of monopsony power, but they don't use it, because they actually have these needs to like solve these other problems of like selecting the right workers or getting workers to exert effort, and so that forces them to like pay a high, not use the full extent of their market power, but instead pay this higher wage. That might also be because of like norms inside the workplace, ideas of fairness, all of this stuff. And so the thing that restrains employers from using their market power isn't competition, but it's all these other complexities of the labor market. And so I think that's like kind of a really interesting direction. It means that there's lots of room for there to be a diversity of ways in which firms are trying to solve these problems. And so you can kind of stop thinking about the firm as just this one kind of unit that does this one thing, but in fact that there's like a plurality of ways of thinking about solving these problems. Okay, so that's that. That was also pointed out in a paper in 1956. So I'm really not inventing anything. But I think one of the things about monopsony that makes it make sense is also it's an old idea kind of given modern garb. It's part of the idea of the labor is a fictitious commodity. It doesn't look like it has a natural competitive market. And so that the free labor market looks nothing like the market for, say, cheeseburgers or something like that there's something different about the labor market. The other thing that it gives you is this kind of a number that we can start like building an empirical agenda around, like estimating this labor supply elasticity facing the firm in these variety of these different contexts, and kind of just see to what extent are employers constrained by the market versus how much wage setting power that they have. And you can kind of like imagine indexing a continuum of labor market institutions by this labor supply elasticity facing the firm. And so let me end with like this one advantage of monopsony that I think it makes it kind of great for today, like labor economics today, is that it's clearly measurable in the sense that you can just think about, oh, when we wiggle the wage, how many workers are leaving, and you can see it in kind of matched worker firm data. You can measure it in surveys. You can just kind of go out and gives you a debate that might have been ideological about like how much power do employers have. You can turn into a number that you can then sort of try to attack in a reasonably rigorous way. And it suggests a variety of experiments to run, and things to go out and measure. And so it's a theory of the labor market that's like, I think, well suited to a data-rich, low-cost experiment world, which is kind of the world we're in. And so I think that's one reason we've sort of seen monopsony come back, is that we're kind of in a world where we can see it in a way that we couldn't before.